Many stories have several levels of reading and seek, through fiction, to convey messages about our very real world. And in my opinion, Tower of God is one of them. But before I start, I'd like to warn you right away, this video will be the deepest analysis I've ever done on Tower of God and will require a lot of recontextualization. And since Tower of God is a Korean work, I'll have to tell you a little bit about the history of Korea and the current situation there, assuming that some people don't know anything about it, so it will be clear for everybody. And as it's just an analysis video of a webtoon, I'm going to make some quick summaries of all that, vulgarizing a little bit, while there is a lot to say. Moreover, I'm neither a historian nor a Korean. I've never been there and I don't even know a Korean who could tell me about it, so my knowledge is necessarily incomplete. All that to say that you shouldn't necessarily take everything I say as absolute truths, and that I advise you to go and see for yourself all the articles on which I base myself in order to go deeper into the subject if you want to, and above all, don't hesitate to correct me in the comments if I'm talking nonsense. Oh, and as far as spoilers are concerned, the video will spoil up to chapter 500 or so, but they'll be pretty minimal spoilers. So for those who don't mind getting spooled on little things, it's okay. Anyway, the purpose of this video will be to tell you about what I think is one of the main messages of Tower of God, if not the main message. I'm going to explain to you how Tower of God, and especially the society that Jihad built in the tower, is a criticism of the two Koreas. First of all, in order to give you the context, I will give you a quick historical point about the origin of the separation between North and South Korea. After the Second World War, in 1945, the world will quickly separate into two blocks. The United States on one side, representing the capitalist, democratic and liberal system, and the USSR on the other, representing the communist ideology. These two great powers will seek to ally themselves with other countries and will constitute what will be called the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. This will be the beginning of what will be called the Cold War, and the first major conflict of this war will be the Korean War, which will take place from 1950 to 1953. To give you the context once again, Korea was occupied by Japan since 1910, a truly atrocious occupation. You just have to go and read about Unit 731 to have an idea of the horror that the Japanese made them live, hence the tensions that are still present almost a century later between Japan and Korea. But in short, with the capitulation of Japan at the end of the Second World War and this new conflict that is the Cold War, the USSR and the USA will replace the Japanese occupation and separate the country in two, North Korea and South Korea, the North being communist and the South being pro-American, pro-capitalism, you could say. The tensions will grow little by little and will end up bursting on June 25, 1950, when the North will attack the South and will trigger the beginning of the Korean War. During these 3 years of war, if it is indeed Koreans who will die mainly, it will be in reality an indirect war between the USSR, also helped by China, and the USA, each one giving weapons to their respective camp while taking care to make believe that it was only a war between Koreans in order not to enter in direct conflict with each other and to start a third world war. This will be, in the end, the main characteristic of the Cold War, the USSR and the USA always confronting each other in an indirect way, hence the name of Cold War. Anyway, the war will finally end on July 27, 1953, and Korea will definitively separate into two blocks, North Korea, which will become a totalitarian communist regime allied to China and the USSR, and South Korea, which will become a liberal democratic regime allied to the USA. I am not going to give you the history of the two Koreas from 1953 until today. So to summarize, today we have North Korea, which is a dictatorship of the most absurd kind, and South Korea, which is an extremely capitalist society, both of which are still in ideological conflicts with each other and have very tense relations. Now, in order to understand what the tower has in common with these two very different Koreas, I will have to look at each of them separately. And to begin with, I will have to detail a little more the situation in North Korea nowadays so that everyone understands. Currently, North Korea is a dictatorship where all the power is concentrated in the hands of one man, Kim Jong-un, and his relatives. And to maintain his power in place despite poverty, famines, and ultra-violent repression of anyone who dares to protest even a little against the power in place, Kim Jong-un and his two predecessors will mainly use propaganda and the cult of personality, which basically consists of doing everything possible to make a person admired to the extreme. The North Korean authorities will push this strategy to the limit by persecuting anyone who practices a religion and by making the veneration of their leader a kind of religion in its own right called Juche, which all North Koreans must follow, inventing all kinds of legends around the leaders, and especially about Kim Il-sung, the first of them, who is almost considered as a god. In every apartment, every house, every street, every subway, etc., there are pictures of the North Korean leaders, even on the clothes that people wear, not to mention the huge paintings, statues, etc. of them. Since childhood you are filled with propaganda, legends and completely false or even absurd historical facts that you are made to learn by heart. Any book, film or other work that does not agree with the ideology of the unique party is forbidden. And of course, on top of all that, everyone is closely watched. People even watch each other since denunciation is encouraged. In short, there are still a lot of things to say about North Korea. I could spend at least an hour on it, but I think you have more or less understood the situation. And if not, I encourage you to go and see some reports on it, testimonies of North Koreans who have escaped, etc. There are a lot of them on YouTube, and each time it's very interesting. But anyway, let's finally start talking about Tower of God. Some may have already understood where I was going with this, but there are many similarities between the North Korean dictatorship and the dictatorship that Jihad imposed on the tower. All the power is concentrated in the hands of one man, Jihad, who just with an order can send his army to war just to kill a small group of people opposing him, as it was the case for the Hell Train regulars at the end of Season 2. But probably the most striking is the similarities concerning the cult of personality. Jihad is truly considered as a god by most of the tower's inhabitants. According to the official version, he is the man who ascended the tower, who brought civilization, peace and prosperity to the tower. And this is quite similar to Kim Il-sung, the first North Korean dictator who is considered as the savior of North Korea, as a powerful soldier who himself fought in the front and shot down many planes, as the pillar on which the lives of all North Koreans rest. And just as Kim Il-sung changed history to make his people believe this, Jihad has also done the same to hide all the crap he is doing on the other side, such as the fact that he has completely erased from history all traces of Arlen, Grace and V. We can also think about all the species that Jihad exterminated or cursed because they were against him during the Great War and Genesis, like with the descendants of the natives ones, the cursed species like aka Williams or Hayura. Anyway, I refer you to my lore video about the history of the tower for more details. These purges are quite reminiscent of the murders or imprisonment of political opponents at the slightest suspicion in North Korea, or the fact that even today, some North Koreans are very strongly discriminated against because their great-grandparents, whom they never knew, would have collaborated with the Japanese during the occupation. And as for the cult of personality, we could have a small idea of the deification of Jihad by the inhabitants of the tower on several occasions. The 10 great families are often glorified and altars are erected in honor of the floor governors by the inhabitants, which can already give a small idea of how normal people see simple governors. But for Jihad, we can talk about the 43rd floor, where he had put altars to his effigy, and where he had many followers who, like real religious fanatics, started to attack Enryu for his heretical words. Well, no luck for them, it was Enryu in front. By the way, remember that Jihad's army killed all the people coming out of the 43rd floor at the beginning in order to avoid the news about Enryu's appearance to spread, because it was questioning Jihad's omnipotence among other things. We can also see this with the altar where the 3 orders will be received, with the real omnipresence of the 3 eyes symbol of Jihad, and in a general way, with the fact that we feel the presence of Jihad absolutely everywhere, whereas he is nowhere. Really, we feel that absolutely everything in the tower depends on him. You should count the number of times we pronounce his name throughout the webtoon. All this while he only appeared twice, once indirectly, and once in a flashback. We could still mention all the people who devote to him an unfailing devotion while fearing him, like the members of the Red, those of the army with Calavan, Liberic, Adori, etc. And that's without mentioning the fact that his extraordinary power and the huge gap with all the normal people of the tower reinforces even more his divine side. Anyway, you can check out my video on Jihad's empire where I go into a little more detail about it. All this to say that just like North Korea, the empire of Jihad uses propaganda to rewrite history and to create a real personality cult around Jihad, presenting him as an almost god who would be both extremely powerful and feared, who possesses all the power in his hands and whose word is absolute, but who is also the savior of the tower in a way, the one who allowed a peace and a sustainable development, the one who was able to create a real civilization by gathering the peoples. And it is for all these reasons that even if we put aside fear, most of the inhabitants of the tower do not want to revolt against Jihad, and even fight to maintain his empire. And this despite all the injustices and all the horrors that this empire has generated, exactly like the inhabitants of North Korea. They are indoctrinated, in fact. That's why the FUG is such a marginal group, and is considered more as a terrorist and criminal group than as a movement that opposes Jihad to build a more just society, even though a certain part of the FUG is obviously guided only by hate and they don't care about creating a better society in the end. It's a complex situation. The world of Tower of God is not Manichaean. But anyway, one objection you could make to me is that SIU could have been inspired by any dictatorship, in fact, since what I'm saying here can be found in every one of them, and not only in North Korea. But what leads me to think that, apart from the fact that SIU, the author, is South Korean, is precisely because Jihad's empire is not a simple dictatorship. There is a big difference between North Korea and Jahad's empire. In fact, the latter seems much freer, more permissive. And globally, it is the opposite of communism and the values advocated by the regime. Because yes, unlike North Korea, it is ultra-capitalist in a sense. Or let's say it acts as a metaphor of capitalism, a capitalism very close in its functioning to South Korea. Well, it's going to be complicated to summarize because there are really a lot of things to say, but South Korea is a country that suffers from many societal problems. The history of South Korea and all that it has undertaken to go from one of the poorest countries in Asia in 1960 to the rich country that we know today is a rather complex subject, and I can't really summarize it like that. But let's say that basically it went through the creation of big family groups called chaebol, to which the government gave a lot of advantages. These groups have names that you all know: Samsung, Hyundai, LG, etc. And of course, when big groups like that are so close to the government, you can imagine all the corruption it can generate. All this with extremely hard working conditions. I'm thinking of the 12-hour days, the absence of minimum wage, the absence of paid vacations, the prohibition to strike and to create unions, etc. And that's without mentioning all the stories of over-indebtedness. And all this to have an explosion of wealth inequalities, and even of inequalities in general, since wealth determines almost everything. In short, it's capitalism. But today the main strategy to make the country internationally competitive is to make South Korea an ultra-competitive society, and this from childhood. Indeed, the Korean educational system is based on an exam set up in 1994, the Suneong. It is a bit like the equivalent of the high school diploma, but more hardcore, like way more hardcore. What you have to understand is not really that the test is hard in itself, but that the principle of the test is to be well ranked at the national level, because it is in fact the classification which will determine, to make simple, the continuation of the studies. The students being in the 2 best percent approximately being able to integrate what is called the sky. Basically, it is the 3 best Korean universities. Being part of these universities guarantees you a job in one of the chaebols, which I mentioned earlier. In short, it guarantees you a big salary, a great social success. Social success that can determine things like who you can marry, as aberrant as it may seem to us, Westerners. Basically, from a very young age, Koreans are told that their whole life will depend on their Suneong score, and to pass they will work very hard. Some parents will pay €1,000 per month for private lessons in the evening in addition to the normal school lessons, and make their kid work from 8 AM to 11 PM non-stop. This test is such a source of stress that the suicide rate among teenagers in Korea is the highest in the world. In fact, the whole Korean school system, and by extension, its whole social system, is based on competition and meritocracy. Or rather the illusion of meritocracy, because I remind you that you have a much better chance of passing the exam if your parents are rich enough to pay you private teachers. And even after that, the competition continues once you're in the corporate world, to keep climbing the ladder, again and again, knowing full well that you'll eventually reach a glass ceiling since, anyway, big companies are family owned, and the top positions are reserved for members of those families. And the worst part is that, in the minds of many Koreans, it's considered a normal thing to do, since they've always been taught about it. There are even 5-year-old kids there who don't ask themselves which job they would like the most, but which one would make them the most money. Like, imagine a kid in elementary school saying, "My dream is to be a financial analyst for Samsung," instead of saying he wants to be a firefighter or an astronaut or whatever. Anyway, I think that gives you an idea of what it's like. And we could go on talking about many other things, like the importance of appearance. Because yes, if you're Korean and you are ugly, you are also in deep shit, because being beautiful is also a real criterion for hiring, even if it is rather implicit. Women especially are judged a lot on their appearance, so much so that almost a third of Korean women have already had plastic surgery. 1 woman out of 3, I don't know if you realize. Anyway, there are really a lot of things to say and criticize about the South Korean society, but those who do it the best are the Koreans themselves. I mean, you only have to look at the number of Korean works that criticize all this to realize how fed up they are. And Tower of God is precisely one of them. Because yes, some of you may have already noticed some common points, but the tower with the system of regulars and rankers set up by Jahad is clearly a metaphor of the ultra-competitive Korean society. Climbing the tower is exactly the same as going to school for South Koreans, except that there you have a little suneong on each floor. We see it from the beginning, on the 2nd floor, called the test floor for reminder, where the regulars who just entered the tower pass tests where they are not tested individually, but are put in competition with each other, and where in the end very few of them will succeed, since they will be about 15 out of 800 to pass to the 3rd floor. And it is also explained to us from the start in chapter 10 that it is not even a question of merit, that meritocracy is just a big joke, with the test of Leroro and his wall of Shinsu. We are made to understand that no matter how hard you try, if you don't have the right innate abilities to get by, you're screwed. We can also see all the drifts that this competitive system will lead to, especially with Ho, who will be jealous of Bam's innate abilities with the Shinsu, and even beyond jealousy, will be especially afraid of failing the tests because of him, and not being able to climb the tower, and will therefore try to eliminate Rachel so that he gives up his ascent of the tower. By the way, all this is a bit of what I had already explained in the video about Rachel. The tower is a place where the regulars kill each other to climb. The blue demon inside Bam sums it up quite well by saying it's the law of the jungle in this tower. It's a place where you have to step on each other's corpses to get to the top. In short, competition taken to the extreme. And even once you become a ranker, which could be described as the transition from school to work, just like in Korea where you have to climb the corporate ladder, the rankers have to climb the ladder too, the RAO ladder. I refer you to the videos I made on RAO, but basically rankers are ranked according to their achievement. And of course, the higher the ranking, the more benefits they can have. It's really a never-ending competition. And we can see both the absurdity of this system and its drifts throughout the webtoon. For example, there is Leifav, who reached the 278th place of the ranking, even though she is anything but powerful and doesn't have much influence. But since she has a power that allows her to one-shot almost everyone with her sniper, she could climb in the ranking by using it. We can also find a criticism of the indebtedness that poor families in Korea can suffer when they finance their children's studies and they fail, with the whole beginning of season 2, with Wang Nan who keeps failing the 20th floor test and is obliged to get into debt to participate again. We will then see the Electrica Cash company taking advantage of all the regulars failing the tests, to get them to take out loans and get them into this infernal cycle of debt. And since we talked about it earlier, we can also talk about the beauty criteria that are often present, like we know that it is one of the selection criteria of the princesses of Jihad, for example. And maybe we can also find a criticism of the chaebols that I was talking about earlier. Indeed, these big family companies close to the government remind me strongly of the 10 great families and their proximity to the Jihad family. We know, for example, that each floor is governed by a member of the 10 great families, except the first one which has no governor, the second one with Evankel, even if it probably changed since then, the 43rd one since there is no more admin, the 77th one since it was given to the Wolhake song, and the 134th one which is directed by Jihad himself. So we see that the control of the 10 great families is operating everywhere. But we also see that they have a certain form of impunity because of their high social status, notably with the dialogue between Ehwa and Angel, where Angel will say that many members of the 10 great families rape women in the intermediate tower. And we can also talk about the fact that being born in one of the 10 great families makes it much easier for you to climb up the ladder, since it guarantees you many innate advantages, which is a bit of a metaphor for the advantages that South Koreans born in good families have thanks to the environment in which they grow up. And especially thanks to the luxury teachers that daddy and mommy can afford. Anyway, there might be many other points around which we could draw parallels with South Korea and North Korea, but I think we have covered the most important ones. Now, one might ask, why do all this? Did SIU really make these parallels on purpose? Does he really have a message to get across? Or is he just subconsciously influenced by the environment he lived in? Is there a real meaning behind it? First of all, it is true that we can be skeptical and say to ourselves that SIU was necessarily influenced by the environment in which it grew up, and that all these common points were made naturally, unconsciously, and that to say that the parallel is wanted would be an overinterpretation. But personally, I don't think so. First of all, because he makes some of these comparisons himself when he talks about the webtoon in his notes at the end of the chapter. But mostly because he himself has suffered and still suffers the ultra-capitalist South Korean system with his webtoon. Because yes, even today, he is in a kind of endless competition with other webtoon. Webtoons are always ranked according to their popularity, their rating, etc. And this is not the case on webtoon here, but in Korea on Naver, it is each chapter that is rated out of 10 by the readers. We also count the number of likes on the chapter, the number of people who follow the webtoon, etc. Knowing of course that the continuation or not of the webtoon depends entirely on these figures. If tomorrow Tower of God doesn't get any more views, if the webtoon gets bad grades or whatever, then it will be stopped and SIU will be jobless, quite simply. And I'm not talking about the working conditions. He only gets 1 week break a year. When he had to take his long break because of his health problems, wrist and all, he wasn't paid anymore, even though the views of Tower of God were exploding all over the world thanks to the anime. He has an incredible working time and has been working for 10 years. I don't even know how many sleepless nights to meet the deadlines and publish his chapter every week. Anyway, I can tell you that he too is fed up with the ultra-capitalism of Korea. As for North Korea, we have to realize that Kim Jong-un's incessant nuclear tests and the very strong regular tensions with the South really marked the life of all South Koreans and therefore his own, of course. All the more so, as the South Korean government emphasizes how awful the North Korean dictatorship is, even going to the extent of supporting, sometimes even financially, North Koreans who have fled the country so that they exaggerate the horror of what they have lived through, as if to make it easier to accept the excesses of South Korea in a way that it is less bad. But anyway, I digress. Beyond the fact that SIU is therefore in the front row to see what's wrong with the two Koreas, there is also the fact that he is an artist, and that artists, if they are influenced by the society in which they live, will also try to influence this same society in return with their art. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, many authors are already doing this very explicitly. To stay in the webtoon, I could quote Lookism, which speaks about many societal problems, and mainly about the judgment on the appearance. We can also quote Bastard, where the villain of the story will never be suspected because of his high social status and will seem untouchable. And if we widen the scope a bit, we can talk about a movie like Parasite, or to be even more direct, we can talk about Squid Game, where the flaws of the South Korean society are very well put forward, to the point that people prefer to go back to playing deadly games than to live one more week in this society. In short, even if I'm not a big consumer of Korean culture, from the little I've seen I can see that there is a lot of contestation, and for Tower of God, from reading the endnotes of SIU's chapter where he complains discreetly about all that, and knowing that the guy seems to be quite committed in general, as we saw when he gave to an association the money he earned with the Tower of God books, well, it seems credible to me that he really wants to criticize Korea through his webtoon, and I even go further by saying that this is perhaps the real meaning of Tower of God. Because indeed, the one who created and set up this society that mixes the worst of both Koreas is Jahad, the ultimate antagonist of Tower of God, the enemy to be put down, the king whose empire must be overthrown. Thus Baum would be a kind of hero fighting this system, and who would be looking for a new solution in order to create a better society. Afterwards, there are necessarily nuances to bring. First of all, considering the trajectory that Baum starts to take, absolutely nothing indicates that he wishes to act for the good of all at the moment. In truth, the one who comes closest to this role is Wang Nan, I think. And I think in particular of his speech when he refused to kill the other asshole in the Game of Rooms at the beginning of Season 2, where he said that he will change the tower, as well as the fact that Kasano, whose goal was also this, joined him. We also know that he is quite connected to Ewa, who wants to stop the abuses of the 10 great families, etc. We feel that there is a small group like that is forming. Also, it's all well and good to want to overthrow an unjust system, to make a revolution and all that, but you have to be able to propose something else instead, especially since Jahad's empire may be horrible, but it manages to maintain order and ensure more or less peace in the whole tower. Again, it's not Manichaean, and we can also ask ourselves how far we can go to fight an unjust society like that. This is a point on which SIU has been really strong in my opinion, by presenting from the beginning the Fug as a really evil group, whose faction was even the main enemy of the whole first part of Season 2. It showed us what could give a group for whom the end justifies the means, a group willing to fight evil with evil, ready to do anything to rebel against this monstrous empire even if it means becoming monsters themselves. And by presenting Baum and his friends as the direct victims of this logic, we were made to understand how bad it could be. But on the other hand, Jahad's empire is so powerful, so sprawling, that only the most extreme methods seem to have a chance of success, hence the whole extremely complex dilemma. There is actually quite a lot of stuff that ties into this in the Nest arc, but I'll talk about it in more detail in the big analysis of the arc, when it will be finished. Finally, there is a last track concerning the message that SIU wishes to transmit to us, and which justifies a bit the history part that I allowed myself at the beginning. It would be that Korea finally decides by itself the path to take. I may be going too far, I admit, but if the two Koreas are separated into a communist and a capitalist bloc, it is only due to the will of the USSR and the USA. These two systems so criticized were imposed to Korea by other countries in fact, and even before that, it is by Japan that Korea was ruled. The Koreans never really chose themselves the direction their country should take. So one could say that when Baum goes to fight the empire of Jahad, representing the worst of the two Koreas and whose power is immense, it is a bit like Baum fighting imperialism itself, the fact of having to submit to great powers and not deciding anything by oneself. Anyway, all this to say that if SIU draws us, through the society created by its main antagonist, a rather clear criticism of the two Koreas, we still don't know if its protagonist, or should I say, if SIU itself, has found a good solution to both put an end to this society and replace it by a better one, which makes my analysis incomplete? Well, yes, definitely. In fact, from the beginning, doing an analysis trying to find the true meaning of Tower of God, if there is one, was doomed to failure, because we are still very far from the conclusion of the story. There is still a lot of mystery, and nobody except SIU knows what is waiting for us at the end, at the top of this tower. And that's what makes the reading interesting, I want to say. That's why I'm waiting for each chapter with impatience, in order to unveil, step by step, the true meaning of Tower of God. Well, I hope you liked the analysis, and that I didn't go too far. I did my best to be both concise and correct on the parts where I talked about Korea, and I hope I taught you some things, because I love using analyses to popularize things, whether it's philosophy, science, history, etc. I like to share knowledge even if I'm not a great expert myself. And by the way, as I told you, I invite you to watch some reports about North and South Korea. There are a lot of them on YouTube, in French and in English, and they are really interesting. I also invite you to check their Wikipedia pages, and even the sources on which the articles are based if you are motivated, because there is really a lot to say on the subject and I really had to simplify a lot in order to not make a 1-hour video. I really think that understanding the country where a work comes from, the context in which it was created and everything, helps to better understand the author who wrote it, and therefore the work itself. Anyway, you can like, subscribe, comment and all, it helps for the referencing. Come and follow me on Twitter and we'll meet in, I don't know, 20 years? Who knows, maybe by then we'll finally know the true meaning of Tower of God.